You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 325.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Hope you're all doing well here in the U.S. on one of the biggest food holidays of the year. Best thing about having a podcast about cookbooks is it seems that we're always talking about baking and food, so it fits right in with today's holiday. We are spending the day with my sister here in the Northern Kentucky area and several of our family members traveling in to spend the day with us. Of course, I've had some of my kids here all week, so we are just enjoying this time together and looking forward to playing some golf tomorrow, maybe doing a craft. And then over the weekend, we have a football game. University of Kentucky plays Louisville, and we are going to set up our Christmas tree because Advent starts on Sunday, and we really only have about 3.5 weeks now until Christmas. So we're going to be getting our tree set up because we have some plans next weekend that will prevent us from doing that. And so away we go with enjoying Thanksgiving and decorating for the Christmas holiday season. So today on the podcast, I am excited to have an interview with Morgan Bolling. Morgan is the executive editor of creative content for Cook's Country and a cast member of the Cook's Country TV show on PBS. Morgan spearheaded the book When Southern Women Cook, History, Lore, and 300 Recipes in collaboration with Toni Tipton-Martin. This compelling book celebrates the ways food has sustained and empowered Southern women throughout history. In this episode, Morgan and I dive into talking about the intersection of food and history inside Southern culinary traditions. We talk about the process of creating When Southern Women Cook and how women writers and cooks were selected to share their stories. We also talk about when we use food as a lens, how food provides insight into shared history and cultural understanding in the South, as well as the way that food has empowered women as a tool for resilience in the South as well. So without further delay, let's dive into this interview with Morgan Bolling. Hi, Morgan. Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast.
Thanks, Maggie. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, excited for you to be here as well. We've got a lot to talk about, but before we get started, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I'm an executive editor for Cook's Country, which is part of America's Test Kitchen. I've been at America's Test Kitchen for a little over 10 years now. I started developing recipes and then I've sort of slowly evolved in my work there and become overseeing recipe development. And I've gotten to work a lot with our editor-in-chief, Toni Tipton-Martin, on some of our projects like this book, but also on doing more deep dive stories and more storytelling that's a little bit newer for America's Test Kitchen.
Yes. So let's start from a very high level here. Why don't you tell everybody, just in case they don't know, about America's Test Kitchen and then about your branch of that you work in, Cook's Country, and what that is and what you do there and a little bit about the story behind Cook's Country.
Yeah, I love that. So America's Test Kitchen was founded in Boston in the early 90s, but it's sort of thing that separates it, or at least where we focus is really in deep dives on recipes. So we will test recipes upwards of 50 times each if we need to get it really reproducible for home cooks and really precise. So we want to make sure that if someone's cooking a recipe from us, that it is you're going to feel proud when you make it. So I feel like there is a full-on test kitchen. We have actually 3 different test kitchens at our office in Boston. And yeah, there's about 40 cooks developing every day here in this office, which is kind of cool. And then Cook's Country is a branch of that. So it's America's Test Kitchen, there's Cooks Illustrated, and there's Cook's Country. I think Cooks Illustrated is a little better or more nationally known. There's also a book team But Cook's Country specific, so Cook's Illustrated is really known for the science and focusing on the science behind food. Cook's Country is a little bit sort of, I think of it as twofold. So we really do a lot of weeknight cooking. So we take some of the lessons learned through Cook's Illustrated and we apply them to weeknight cooking. So you have this like approachable. And then the part that is much more relevant for this book is we focus on a lot of regional stories and then telling the stories of people and culture through food. So especially like I would say in the past 4 years or so, but even before that, we were really focusing on like storytelling through food within our brand. But we're trying to use that same rigor for recipe development, but also just combine it with the narrative behind it.
Yeah. So Cooks Illustrated has a magazine, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
they have a television show called America's Test Kitchen.
Exactly.
Okay. And then you guys, Cooks Country, have a magazine also.
Yep.
And your show is also called Cooks Country.
Yep.
Okay.
Both PBS. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're both on PBS, and I encourage people to tune in if you haven't done that before. They're both delightful shows. And you're right. Cooks Illustrated or the America Test Kitchen show is it is more science oriented or, technical things. They test tools. They look at, they look at like 5 garlic press, things that you can use, how to juice lemons, things like that. And then yours took it to the next level, of course, which perfectly ties in with the book that we are talking about today, because there was a direct connection between the work that you all were doing in Cook's Country and what led you to working on this book and writing this book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that story? Why don't you start with Toni Tipton-Martin, who is your executive editor, her role there, and then how you all decided to write this book.
I would love to. I love speaking about Toni. Like she is our editor-in-chief. She joined back in 2020, I believe, maybe 2020. I think 2020. And her background is in telling sort of the untold stories of people through food. She's done a lot of work covering Black chefs and sort of like telling stories about Black cooks and chefs and through food. So she's written 3 books now. Well, actually, she's written more than 3 books, but she's, I think, particularly well known for individually writing 3 specific books. And the Jemima Code was the one that was her first. She wrote Jubilee, and then she recently wrote Juke Joints, is a cocktail-based book. So she brought in this sort of like she is a primary food historian. And so she really brought in this idea of like finding where a recipe came from, like undigging its background and really using a journalistic approach to how we approach our recipe development at Cook's Country. So really trying to like dive in and be like, okay, if there is something like, if we have all these different kind of biscuits in the South, where did they each come from? Like, where did the different variations come? Like, where Angel biscuits were probably from Martha White or White Lily, but like, how did the different ones come to evolve? Like, who created these? Like, let's try to give credit to the people and tell their stories as we're like talking about these recipes.
Yeah.
So we've started doing that both in the magazine and then coming into this book as well.
Yeah. And then you had an idea for a book, something that you all could work on together. Tell us a little bit about your vision for what you wanted to do.
Yeah. So it sort of was a funny mix of things. Like so America's Test Kitchen actually was the one that really wanted to do a Southern book. We actually will send out surveys to people to understand like what our readers think of the magazine. We really try to get input from people. And so specifically with this, we knew that we wanted to do a Southern book because it had people seemed like very interested in it. I personally have a lot of background with working with women. And so I volunteer at the Cambridge Women's Center, which is a local organization in Cambridge. And I run a support group there. And I've sort of for years always wanted to do a book that combined highlighting women and empowering women with food, but I didn't know how exactly to do that. And then when Toni came in and she had done all these books that sort of did that in a different way or covering a different demographic, she was like, okay, maybe we can start doing this. So it sort of was like the slow, okay, we need to do this. We want to do this. We want to do this. And then slowly together, they kind of morphed into this book called When Southern Women Cook. And so we wrote a proposal for that together. Toni and I were kind of went through the channels of the Test Kitchen. We're like, we are so excited about Southern Book. Toni was president of Southern Foodways Alliance for a little while, so she's very near and dear to the South. I grew up in the South. I'm from North Carolina. And so I think both of us have a love and affinity for Southern culture, Southern food. And then we both found a way to kind of combine it with this womanish angle and like really highlighting some of the women who have created the Southern food culture as it is.
Yeah. And did you have a lot to lean on from Cook's Country, or did you have to create a whole lot of new content?
No, we had a ton. I mean, the Cook's Country's been around since like I think we're at over 18 years now. I should double check that, but something like that. So I think it's 2006, that we started as a magazine. So we have years and years of archives of recipes so we could pull from. And since we do so much regional food, we've done a lot of Southern specialties. So like one of my coworkers, Brian, part of his job is to travel around and interview people and like find local food stories. So he like has done a lot of research on Southern food. I, again, like even coming from North Carolina, and then I built some of our magazine lineup, we've had a lot of recipes that I've pushed for. So we had a ton in our archives. Actually, we started the process by going through our archives and seeing what recipes we already had. And we had well more than are in this book. But then we also Toni also had her own, she weighed in. So I sort of gathered like, these are all the Southern recipes we have.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like over 600.
Wow.
And then Toni weighed in and was like, okay, well, let's look through those and start thinking like, which ones are we actually missing too? Like we had this crazy long list. And then I worked also with a Southern food historian who played a huge role in this book, Casey Highsmith. She also weighed in and was like, okay, well, you guys are missing a few classics. We also need those in here too. So we had this huge list, and then we slowly started narrowing it down based on we also went through and we're like, which of ours are so old they need an update, or like they were developed before we were as careful about doing deep research on culture associated with a food, or like, we also were even like, do we have too much stuff from New Orleans, which we did have too much stuff. There's so much good food in New Orleans that we're like, okay, this book's going to feel like half New Orleans at a certain point. So we had to start eliminating and like really narrowing it in. And then we were also looking at the lens of like, okay, what's a story we can tell connected to a woman with this recipe? So like, I think we also were looking at it through that lens of like there was a recipe we ended up cutting called Lynchburg lemonade that has a really interesting backstory. It's a cocktail. But it has a very mannish story. So we cut it from and it'll eventually have a home somewhere, but it's just not in this book. So I think there was also that helped us eliminate down, and we ended up with 300 recipes, which is still not short. And a lot of them, I think it's about 50 of them are totally new. So it's about 6 of them are totally new. A handful of them are also updated. A handful of them are from external contributors who like don't work at the test kitchen, but had a reason, like we had a reason we wanted to work with them rather than try to like create a recipe internally. So it's a big mix.
Yeah. So the contributed recipes, then you bring them into your kitchen, you give them a try, you adapt them to the style of the book, you add the stories, and then you're able to really expand the breadth from people that probably have written about food or written cookbooks or had restaurants that could, I guess, been from anywhere.
Yeah, it was sort of a big mix because I mean, actually, most of the contributors we had were more writers just because we feel like at America's Test Kitchen, the expertise we have is recipe development. So we kept most of that within our company. But yeah, there are plenty that were like, okay, we really want someone external to write this recipe. Or like, we also, like one that comes to mind because it's so delicious is we have these like oatmeal guava cookies. It's from Daniela Signor, who owns Colada Shop in DC. But she's a woman who she owns all these Cuban restaurants. And so we wanted to like have something that represented her restaurants. We're like, well, we're not going to develop a recipe that represents her restaurant. Like we should use her recipe. And so we worked with her. We did exactly. We like got it in house. We made it. We did put it in our style. I'd go back and forth with her and be like, is this okay? Do you have any tips for this? Like, and we go from there. And then eventually we get to a place where we're both happy. So.
Yeah. And what was the breadth of the South that you all included in the book?
That's a good
geographically,
question. Yeah. So we did from DC down we included Florida and all the way out to Tennessee, or not Tennessee, to Texas. So we used U.S. Census Bureau for what they call the South, which is huge. But we were like, well, We're gonna do it. Let's do it. I think
Yeah.
a lot of these states could have their own books and like maybe one day, but I think that like, yeah, we were trying to go pretty big.
Yeah, and even like you mentioned, a city like New Orleans, so much food in that city, and it could have and it does, books of its own. Texas, books of its own. Florida, books of its own. But this was talking about women and
Mhm.
women's involvement in their stories in Southern food and how food has always been a tool for women's empowerment in the South. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's something that we maybe don't think that deeply about all the time. And what you learned from working on this book about that topic.
Yeah. So one of the things that like, even though we're picking up a lot of recipes from our archives, we were rewriting every head note that ran with the recipes, both to like tell stories about women and also just to be more comprehensive in our history, especially if it was an older recipe. And so that ended up with a lot of researching, a lot of deep diving. And like, I don't know if the surprise is the right word because I don't think it's totally surprising, but it's one of those things that I just kept seeing as a theme. And by the time I like continue to see it, it was like very empowering and exciting to think about like how many stories are tied to women creating financial independence through food. So like if you like read them, I know we have like Dr. Psyche Williams Forson. She talks about like selling fried chicken and women making money through that in her intro essay for the fried chapter. But then we also have like women would sell challahs and like that's how they would create economic independence. Like there's a story of two women who during the Great Depression like maintain their life, not even their lifestyle, but just like stayed afloat by selling bourbon balls. And there's like a woman who was nicknamed Queen of the Bootleggers because she would sell moonshine and her community, and she would then like use that money to put back into the community. So she would like send kids to school by using her money from selling moonshine. And so like there's all these kind of like fascinating stories sprinkled throughout of like women who sort of were like, okay, I need to figure this out. I'm gonna figure out how to like either gain an economic independence so that I can have that sort of freedom myself or take care of my family and allow them that or community. And they used food as a way to do that, which is a really kind of cool thing.
Yeah, I'm having a moment here about Kentucky. I think Maggie Davis, the bootlegger, was from Kentucky.
She was.
Yeah. And the bourbon ball lady might have been too.
I think Rebecca Ruth. I can't remember,
I
but
think they were.
I think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
It
amazing.
makes
So
sense.
yeah,
Kentucky
yeah.
and bourbon.
Yeah,
I like
Kentucky
it.
and bourbon and Kentucky and moonshine. And Maggie
Yep.
Davis was 17 and she literally used what she did for the benefit of her community. And, there was that time when you didn't have access to um, alcohol and prohibition is in particular. And of course, in Kentucky, so much of what people did was the bourbon industry was responsible for a lot of livelihood here, and it was devastating in a lot of ways when a lot of those distilleries closed. But um, just love the I don't know. I think it's always neat when you're from somewhere, and like you with being from North Carolina, I'm sure, like you said, there were some things that you made a little plug for, wanted to see North Carolina represented. And, I keep thinking about that now with what's going on there with the terrible flooding they had from Hurricane Helene and how all the people in the South at the community level, just rallying together, trying to
Mhm.
support the people that are there. And food is one of the things that the restaurants, are doing and people coming in to just feed people. And just
Yeah. So
such a
it's
trying time, yep.
it is. It's so interesting. I was thinking about that because we have a recipe in here for Eastern North Carolina fish stew that was like and I got to interview Chef Vivian Howard on the eastern side of the state when we developed that. And she actually, I'm forgetting the name of the hurricane, but there was one that went through the eastern side of the state maybe like 7 years ago or so. And she started selling her fish stew as like a fundraiser for that. And then now with Hurricane Helene, it's like Katie Button is in Asheville. She wrote a piece for this book as well. And she's like closed down her restaurant, but she's working with Jose Andres's foundation. And she's like serving her community now out of Curate, her restaurant. I don't know if it's out of that same space or if she's just using but
Yeah.
she's like taking care of her community in that same way. And it's
Right.
like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's always and food is a lens, it is a tool, and I'd love to dive into the book and talk a little bit first about the table of contents. I always think it's
Yes.
fun to
Get
look
it
at a
over.
book from that perspective. So it looks like there's 14 different chapters, everything from breadbasket down to Southern sippers, which is, I'm assuming, beverages,
Mhm.
cocktails, things at the end of the book.
Yep.
When you think about these chapters, from the garden, rice and grits, in the stew pot, sandwich icons, I just love how cookbooks more and more, the story of the book is being told through the table of contents. It's not just like appetizers, soup, salad, desserts anymore. It's and check that out if your listeners or it's always just a great thing to do to just look at the table of contents. And then flavor and preserved, everyday treats, celebration sweets. So let's pick a chapter. What do you want to talk
I
about?
love that. I know. Well, it is so fun. We actually play with this organization. Like in my first spreadsheet of recipes, we like had columns of how we'd organize it and we resorted it multiple times. But I kind of love this because even the names feel like, I mean, one of the other editors on this book, Sasha, she really helped like name each of them. I mean, we both went back and forth on the naming. I'd like send her three and she'd be like, well, what about this? And we'd tinker with them. But we wanted it to feel very Southern in each of them. Let's see. I'm like,
Yes,
Southern.
one that
Yeah.
I think is unique that we don't hear about, might not hear about in a book from the Northeast or parts of the Midwest would be the outdoor cooking and eating chapter.
Ooh, I
Because
love
of
that.
the weather, we can do that a lot. And the season with which we can eat outdoors and cook outdoors is extended. And sometimes, depending on what part of the South you're in, it could be for many months out of the year. So tell us a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, that one's one of my favorites, so I will happily go to that one. So this one was one that we actually even debated if we should include in this book, just because barbecue is its own, it's like barbecue and grilling. It's such its own world that like it again feels like it could warrant its own cookbook, but we kind of wanted to really play off this idea that barbecue and grilling is typically so masculine and it's thought of as like the men grill and the women like are typically like inside in the kitchen doing a lot of the prep work. And so we kind of like, we're like, okay, let's just do it. We'll figure out the stories. And we actually, as we started diving, found plenty of stories to tell about women. So that was a really fun one. And then I definitely do a lot of barbecue. I've sort of become the go-to barbecue person at the test kitchen for developing our grilling and barbecue recipes, at least for Cook's Country, because of my own personal passion in it. And so I had a ton of, it was really fun to write this intro. The chapter intro is kind of playing off that concept of like, why is barbecue thought of as a male activity or such a like, and it does, there is some history that plays into it. And then there's like some advertising from the 1950s. So it was a really fun one because I feel like I got to like dive into something I was really interested in anyway, but also play off like why does this stereotype exist? Or why does this like gender dynamic exist?
Right. Any stories that come to mind when you think of women involved in outdoor cooking?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my favorites that I found while looking on this book was of Chef Gigi. So she's in Atlanta and she was a K-pop star. So she was a Korean pop star. And then she actually, I think, got kind of burnt out with that. And she moved to the US. She started dating a guy who was from Texas. And somewhere, I know they got married. I don't remember what the timeline is, but they eventually opened a restaurant in Atlanta that does barbecue. And it has this really interesting mix because it combines his Texas sort of, and like he was born in Texas and raised in Tennessee, and it has his sort of heritage combined with her Korean background. So they do like gochujang ribs, and we have it next to our smoked chicken wings because they do a smoked chicken wings. So they serve with a kimchi mayo. So just like the story of her and this like dynamic past to me was super interesting. I really liked that one.
Yeah. And that's smoked chicken wings. The recipe that's with that story looks delicious. So if you want to learn how to smoke chicken wings, looks like a great place to start. And love how it combines her background and her traditional foods and ingredients with the barbecue topic.
Yeah.
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 Anybody else?
Yeah. I mean, this is a fun contributor essay. So we have stories from 70 women in this book, and one of them is Dr. Marcy Cohen Ferris, who's she's written a couple cookbooks or actually she's written a cookbook and a couple food history books. And she is Jewish and has written she wrote a cookbook called Matzo Ball Gumbo. And so she wrote a piece for us that talks about growing up in the South. I believe she's in Chapel Hill. I know she's connected to UNC Chapel Hill. And so she's like sort of played off this, like how pork is so prevalent in North Carolina. And like what it's like to be Jewish around that. And so like in her sort of like backstory of like, should I eat pork and should I not? And when do I make that decision? So that she wrote a piece and we ran it next to our North Carolina barbecue pork recipe. So I thought that was a really, like, it's like a little bit, I like her tone a lot in it. It's a really fun read, I think. So that was a really fun one. And it's like, kind of like her take on it.
Yeah. So a lot of the contributors then, they would write a piece for the book, something, food related, but it didn't always mean that they contributed a recipe if they wrote something for the book.
Yeah, not always. In fact, actually, more often than not, no. It depends what recipe. Like some recipes we did specifically tie them to that, but I would go back and forth with them and be like, well, sometimes I think we'd just be like, especially early on, I was like, I don't know exactly where your piece is going to go, but it sounds great and I'll keep you posted along the way. But often I think we were like, okay, we think we'll probably try to land this next to our piece on something like, I'm trying to think of what a good example was. Like I know, well, specifically like Cynthia Grabart, we had her write a piece on fricasseed chicken and smothered chicken. And we knew that was going to run next to our smothered chicken recipe.
I see.
So like we sort of would cherry pick where they would go. But I do think there's some to me quirkiness about some of them and where they land. But I kind of like that. Like sometimes they feel like an obvious tie to the recipe they're with. And sometimes they sort of feel like it takes you a second to be like, but I kind of like that you get so much storytelling within all of these.
That's right. So let's go to another chapter. What do you think?
I love the Southern Sippers. It's a really fun one. I think like it's a mix of, it does have plenty of non-alcoholic drinks, and then it has also cocktails and different things, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, and I think that it's good to have both. And I think it's interesting when people think about cocktails, non-alcoholic beers and cocktails are very popular. And but I think you can't have the conversation about the South without having cocktail recipes in it. It's kind of like they go hand in hand. So I think it's neat that you decided to talk about both. Why don't we talk about something that has a real, let's see, any recipe that comes to mind? What about the cherry bounce? I'm not sure if everybody knows what cherry bounce is or what you all learned about that.
Okay, I didn't know what cherry bounce was until I did this book. And cherry bounce is I think it's the unofficial drink of North Carolina. So I'm like, shame on me for not knowing this. But it's a really fun, it's essentially like a homemade liqueur. So you're taking cherries and macerating them with sugar, or I guess I don't even know if macerating is the proper word. You're letting them sit with sugar and brandy, sometimes some warm spices, and you're letting it go for upwards of like a month. Our recipe calls for a month, and it is a really fun, like you can sip on it as you would port or as you would cherry liqueur. You also can, like, if you want not water it down, but you can add it to like a little bit of it to a seltzer and have like sort of a spritzer sort of thing, which is really nice.
Yeah. We traveled to Wisconsin this summer, and that's where the first time I heard about cherry bounce. We went to a place that had I guess they had different kinds we did a wine tasting, and you want to try cherry bounce. And so I thought it was fascinating that it was in here. And of course, the story is about Martha Washington and her cherry bounce.
Yeah, she would make it. And then apparently George Washington would like carry it on his carry it with him when he would like go out into the world. Like, so she actually, like, we have her original recipe. I think it was, the Library of Congress, I think, has her original recipe. And so we like have that in here. She would apparently make huge amounts. It's like 20 pounds of cherries.
Yeah.
But it's kind of cool to think of her like sitting there making cherry bounce, or I imagine she was probably doing it with other women at the time.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Southern Milk Punch?
Yeah, so that's a fun one. I actually learned a lot of what I have in here from Sarah Camp and her book. She wrote a book, co-authored a book for Southern Foodways. And so we kind of got a little bit of information I remember reading that pretty closely to get here. But so there's two kinds of milk punch. There's clarified milk punch, which is the British version that I feel like it's also having sort of a moment now at restaurants, and it's the clear one. But Southern Milk Punch is much more like eggnog without eggs. Like it's a creamier cocktail, and it like our version has light cream, but you can see versions with heavy cream or milk. And it has a little warm spice in it, but it's much easier to put to like you're not dealing with eggs. It's a little bit frothy. Like we do ours in the shaker. If you want to do a big batch, you could do it with a stand mixer to kind of get some frothy, or an immersion blender, get some frothiness to it. But it's really delicious. Like it's often a New Orleans. It's from New Orleans, or it's really popular in New Orleans. And it can be served on holidays. It's also a thing you can get in birthdays or like at any sort of celebration. Like it doesn't have to just be a holiday thing. I think because it's so similar to eggnog, people started associating it with the holidays.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really fun one.
Yeah, it's neat. Mm-hmm. Anything else that you think of in the book that you'd like to mention as we're wrapping up this discussion about the recipes or the chapters? Yep.
I know. Well, I'm trying to think of like which some fun ones are. I mean, like it was sort of interesting to go into some of these, just thinking through. I had so much fun with the 2 dessert chapters, which are 12 and 13. But we just had so many desserts. We had to do 2 dessert chapters. Like we kept trying to eliminate. We're like, no, we just have to do it. And I know you were talking, Ann Burns has her Southern book out recently that's specifically focused on Southern baking. And this definitely could have its own book. But these stories were really fun. Like I love the chocolate souffle recipe is a nice it's actually a make ahead recipe for chocolate souffle, which is just, to me, feels like a gift for people who want to do a chocolate souffle because it can be really tentative. But we dug into Edna Lewis she's one of her recipes she was famous for at Farrington House when she worked there was her chocolate souffle. But she also has 2 different published recipes. So it's cool to like look at her 2 different versions and think through that.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I mean, the South End desserts just like, go together. That's for sure.
Oh my gosh, so true. Yeah, there's a beautiful plum porter plum pudding layer cake that's like, we got to speak with Robin Lee Griffith, who's the great granddaughter of Eliza Seymour Lee, who's this woman who was a free woman. She's a Black free woman from Charleston, and she actually like was free. She again sustained her economic independence through baking. And so Robin wrote about her grandmother, great grandmother, and she let us use her recipe. Her recipe was very old school. It was a steamed plum pudding, and it had like lard, and it was really tasty. But we sort of updated it to be this really modern layer cake that's like beautiful, so that it sort of feels like something people would want to make for the holidays, but would still get this little nice reminder of Eliza. And like it was like and sort of get that same inspiration, but with something that feels a little more modern. That's it.
Yeah, wonderful. And we have barely scratched the surface. Just so everyone knows, this does have 300 recipes, and there is a lot to read, which is wonderful. So if you love to read cookbooks, or someone that loves to read them, and this topic is of interest to you, then it would be a great book for the holiday season or to add to your own collection. Mm. All right. Well, let's start to wrap things up here. I love to ask, this is always kind of a challenging question for some people because if you work in the food space, you love cookbooks, but I'm always curious if you have a favorite cookbook and what that might be.
Okay. I have a lot of favorite cookbooks, but the first one that comes to mind is probably just totally a nostalgic pick. I have my grandmother's gourmet cookbook. And so it's one of those like, older versions. I think it was from like 1960 or something like that, but it has her recipes and her notes scribbled in the sides. And then like she has a few like inserted pages of her own that are her recipes. So I think for me, that's sort of like it just has such an emotional tie. I think that would be fun.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Very good. And I will link to can often find used copies of cookbooks online. So I'll link to that in case anyone, I'm sure people listening, they have a collection. They maybe have some of the gourmet cookbooks in their collection. A lot of people still hang on to a lot of the magazines.
Yeah.
So very, very unique and storied magazine that has certainly played a huge role in a lot of people learning how to cook and reading about food from a print magazine.
Yeah.
So Morgan, why don't you talk about a little bit about the best way for them to connect with Cook's Country online, and if there's anything about the book, any special thing that they would need to do to read more about the book?
Yeah, so you can definitely find more about the book on either cookscountry.com or americastestkitchen.com. We're also, of course, promoting it as much as we can on our social handles. So that's at Test Kitchen and at Cooks Country. So if anyone wants to follow either of those, or like they'll get a lot more updates about it. We're actually doing some social reels and that like cover the stories from the book. So
yeah. Did you get to travel any while you were doing the book?
I didn't specifically for this book. I have gotten to for a couple other little projects here and there, but we're going on a book tour soon. So I'll get to travel for that, and it'll be all in the South, and I'm very excited about that.
Do you have any highlights or know where you're going to be, or a place where people that are listening could learn about the locations?
Yeah, so that's actually also on americastestkitchen.com, and we'll be Toni and I are kind of splitting them up. So if you like really want to see like Toni, you should specifically look at which ones she's at, or me. But we're starting in DC. Well, actually, we're starting in Chapel Hill. Then we'll do DC. We're hitting Nashville, Charleston, Atlanta. We'll do an event in Boston because it's where we are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, great. That'll be fun. Well, I wish you the best of luck with that, and I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today to tell us about your new book that you co-authored with Toni Tipton-Martin, When Southern Women Cook: History, Lore, and 300 Recipes, with contributions from 70 women writers.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green, and until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.